Thank you everyone for joining us today. And I would like to welcome you to this session on peace building in multipolar world today. Today we will explore how peace building efforts in MENA region are evolving amidst changing global and regional political dynamics. As traditional power structures shift and new actors such as Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, and United Arab Emirates are influencing these regions and these conflicts. At the same time, local civil society organizations in Yemen, Syria, and Sudan are playing a crucial role in advancing peace processes and promoting justice. Today, we will hear from experts and activists directly involved in these peace-building initiatives. Speakers like Maha Tambal from DT Institute, Patricia Karam from Freedom House, Monzer Al-Salal from Destabilization Support Unit in Syria, and Mutahar Al-Bathigi from the Yemeni Coalition for Monitoring Human Rights Violations will share their insights and their expertise with us. This session will be structured into 3 rounds of questions. In the first round, I will ask our speakers to provide an overview of their work and share key insights related to the session's theme of peace building in multipolar world. The second round of questions will focus on influences and dynamics shaping peace processes in Yemen, Syria, and Sudan, and how these forces and how these new power players impact local and regional conflicts. In the final round of questions, we will discuss the opportunities and challenges in international and bilateral advocacy and hear from our speakers lessons learned in engaging with these regional power players. At the end of these rounds, if time allows, we will open the floor for questions from the audience. I encourage you all to use question and answers and chat functions to pose your questions and leave your comments. Thank you once more for joining us today. And as we move into discussion, I would like to start by posing the first question to our colleague, Patricia Karam from Freedom House. Patricia, with your extensive background in governance, civil society, and human rights advocacy across the MENA region, could you share with us, from your perspective, what are the main challenges that peace processes face in this multipolar world, where new political groups are emerging alongside traditional global powers?
Thank you, DT Institute, to participate in this panel. I'll say, before answering directly your questions, I just will say a couple of words about what Freedom House does in general. And just very roughly, sort of our objective is to work with activists and help them in their struggles for freedom and human rights. And this directly relates to sort of peace building, and the way that Freedom House does it is through a number of approaches or strategies, including providing emergency assistance and resiliency grants to civil society activists, as well as types of capacity building, security training and support, as well as targeted action that helps improve kind of the resilience of activists. And at the same time, Freedom House is also sort of heavily engaged in mobilizing support for protecting human rights, among international audiences, and really an important component of this is a peace building component. Now, in terms of thinking about challenges to peace processes, I would just point out that there are not only new actors, but new tactics. And I'll make 3 points. I would say that it's important to keep in mind that warfare is really not anymore simply about the use of brute force, but there are other tactics that are being deployed, like reliance on information and narrative control, co-optation of local elites, economic levers, and negotiations that are asymmetric in that regard. And this includes also using humanitarian aid as a mechanism of control. So there is also, this sort of translates sometimes as a top-down kind of management of conflict, which even uses violence and conflict to impose peace. So for example, here, Tunisia is a case in point. It's not one of the contexts we're looking at, but it's indicative in that in the malign roles that the regional players like the UAE and Saudi Arabia have played in countering democratic narratives. From this type of scenario, a type of kind of illiberal peace kind of emerges that poses a challenge to liberal norms that really underpin peace-building efforts, and sometimes take the form of a backlash against liberal values. This can provide stability in the short term, but in the long term, it cannot resolve conflicts. There is the second point that I want to make that will hopefully relate to what my fellow panelists will discuss, is the fact that war is oftentimes, as we know it, and as everyone on the panel has experienced it, is fought by proxy. And this is certainly the case of malign regional powers like Iran, that are central to kind of the endurance of conflict in some of these places. And this means that conflict is sustained by these local, oftentimes by local militias that are backed by regional powers, which tend, I mean, the local militias also tend to have a regional power base and the ability to serve at the same time, so a contradictory role, the ability to serve as an intermediary between authorities and the population. But they rarely have the interest of local communities in mind. And I'm thinking of Syria, for example, and how militia support for the Assad regime has really enabled also some of these militias to gain political influence and be part of the governing structures. And it is usually accepted that demobilizing militias is a first step for post-conflict resolution and peace. And now, in a case like Syria, dislodging militias becomes difficult, especially when they're so entrenched and their backers are not supportive of this demobilization. And the backers, I'm thinking of Russia and Iran. So as long as the regime's continuing and economic stability and continuation depends on this militia forces, this will not be prioritized. So just something to keep in mind. And finally, the much more general but basic principle that violence itself is often a challenge to peace building. And those who try to end violence are faced with opposition from those actors who don't really want to end it. And factions who see peace as really against their interests and are willing to continue to use violence to undermine it. And I think this is applicable to all the settings that we are discussing.
Lovely. Patricia, thank you so much. Maha, turning to you. So, considering all experience the DT Institute has in Sudan, and in addition to that, your extensive experience in Sudan, so from your perspective, how do you navigate the challenges posed by countries like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Egypt when their political agendas conflict with local peace-building efforts?
Yeah, thank you so much, Vikashan. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. First of all, I really wanted to thank Alliance for Peace and Data Institute for bringing to the surface the forgotten conflict and crisis of Sudan. Just to give a quick background on what we are doing in Data Institute to support Sudan. We are collectively working to implement strategies where we can use the rule of law to improve human rights and democracy in MENA and Sub-Saharan Africa, including Sudan. In those regions, polarization and conflict are always interconnected in countries like Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. So with that in mind, DT Institute continues to adopt kind of locally driven programming strategies to advocate for accountability. For instance, our Informed Communities Mobilized Against Corruption program is focusing on holding corrupt perpetrators accountable for human rights violations, particularly in the context of post-April. So we do that through supporting stakeholders to understand the challenges that local actors will face when it comes to engaging with regional powers like Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, Russia, Egypt, and you name it. Particularly, we know those powers have their own interests that really conflict with principles of transparency and accountability. So we keep leveraging the role of independent investigations to document for corruption and human rights violations. We keep also working on our other portfolio on the peace building program, where we're building the capacities of the local stakeholders to have their own community-driven approach to equip them with necessary skills and capacities to foster positive peace. So with that in mind, when we look at the challenges, I think we really need to spell out those challenges. So I think when it comes to regional countries' role in Sudan, there is a big component related to the geopolitical interest and regional agendas. We know that Saudi Arabia and Emirates, for instance, have been significantly involved in Sudan, especially during the active war in Yemen. We know that both countries we're financing, we're paying money. Just to echo Patricia's point on proxy war, the Sudanese military forces, either in the Sudan Army Force or the Rapid Support Forces, have been involved in proxy war in Yemen under the Arab Coalition back in 2015. But still, the involvement of those countries or those powers, as I mentioned, it's not only conflicting with principles of accountability and transparency. We also see those now reports coming as the conflict continues to erupt in Sudan, reports and independent investigations coming, capturing the role of Emirates in providing logistical support to RSF through either Haftar of Libya or through Chad and CAR Republic borders. And in those countries, we know that Wagner Group is being actively involved also with military institutions to smuggle the Sudan gold and take it to Emirates, where the companies affiliated to SAF and RSF are operating. So you see, it's how complicated the economic interest for Emirates, for instance, in Sudan. So that Emirates is seeing Sudan as a strategic gate for its growing geopolitical rivalries to impose its hegemony on the Red Sea port region and also in West Africa, maybe all the way up to the far north of the MENA region. And another challenge is really related to the regional peace and security threats. We see that I'll try to slow down. Thank you. So similarly, as I mentioned, the regional peace and security threats for Sudan from the regional countries, we have Iran that has its own allies in Yemen, and we have our Yemeni colleagues who can speak better than me about that. But still, when you look at the security calculations, we have the Houthis in the other side of the Red Sea, and those groups are backed up by the presence of the Russian military base in Port Sudan, the de facto capital of the country now. And the same security threats are applied to Egypt. Egypt national security become highest priority for them. So despite that, the Egypt economy is being kind of stifled by the millions of Sudanese people displaced since last year, but still Egypt will not allow a lasting peace process that really could transmit the Sudanese calls for change from Sudan to Egypt. So you see, it's been like those international powers are really perceiving international accountability mechanisms such as those are supported by civil society or international accountability mechanisms. They are perceiving them as a threat to their regional influence or even relationship with local actors. So that's the greatest challenge for civil society really to navigate. These countries may view the international human rights and anti-corruption efforts as kind of a foreign interference, particularly when such initiatives challenges the status quo or expose politically sensitive issues. So we really need to take into consideration those growing regional threats while we navigate how to empower the civil society to play a pivotal role in the region. Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Maha. Moving to Syria. Onzer, I wanted to ask you, what challenges have Syrian civil society organizations faced when trying to ensure that local peace-building efforts remain actually focused on the needs of Syrian communities? We know that several regional powers like Iran, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia all have a very competing interest in Syria, and they're trying to dictate overall, I would say, both political and peace-building agenda in Syria. So from that perspective, what how civil society and peace building movements in Syria still focused on the needs of Syrian communities.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Vacation. And I'd love to thank everyone for providing this opportunity for us to speak and elaborate on peace building. In fact, the role of the civil society and especially the civil society organizations in Syria is largely effective role in peace building, be it at the, I mean, in multiple levels, be it on accounting or in the community-based level, or even on the political level as well. And so what we see in Syria, what we're watching at those three levels in accountability, the civil society organizations in France and Germany, the Syrian organizations have held Bashar al-Assad accountable. And there have been warrant of arrest issued for Bashar al-Assad. I mean, there was trials against Bashar al-Assad in France as well as Germany. Many trials against perpetrators who contributed in the suppression and killing of Syrians. On the political level, we can see a role of the civil society organizations to communicate the desires of the Syrian people in terms of the political needs and the Syrian people demand of for the future of Syria, as well as to get the different perspectives closer between politicians and the people, and to try and establish custodies for peace building. Speaking on the community and the society, or before that, actually, you know what the civil society organizations have done in the USA, establishing a law for accountability for a Caesar law, and the law, the counter normalization law, is work under progress, and before that, regarding the Captagon. So these are efforts of the civil society organizations, which is going to contribute to impose the peace. Or let me be clear about this. The international community is heading toward Bashar al-Assad regime, but what precludes this trend toward Bashar al-Assad regime is the efforts of the civil society organizations in accountability and in the legal aspect to impose peace and not to impose the regime. And so there's an important role. However, the challenges, for sure, I'm sorry, maybe I sidetracked away from your question. Just as an introduction and a brief about the Syrian civil society organization's efforts. We are so interested and keen in the peace building topics in terms of the community. So we start from the bottom of the pyramid. We don't start from the top. And so the challenges that we struggle for because of the international interferences. So let me be blunt about this. As well known in Syria now, there are three different regions of leverage, areas under control of Turkey, areas under control of Iran and Russia, which is the region areas, as well as the international coalition. And the challenges lie in the concerns of the regional countries. So Turkey is concerned of establishing a Kurdish entity on its border, led maybe by PKK, which is designated as terrorist organization. Iran, on the other hand, is concerned of increased leverage of Turkey in Syria. And Iran wants ways, it doesn't want any entity that can affect its, routes from Iraq to Lebanon. And so it also needs a favorable environment. Let me call it like an environment that fits the Shiite ideology or the Iranian ideology, if I may. The coalition, of course, being there, as we all know, it's to fight ISIS. So there are concerns and fears might be deeply rooted for some, but for others, it's just concerns for interest and for leverage. So to be able to work without, without having to confront the regional interfering countries, we need to take into account that if we want to get to our destination, we need not to confront with the red lines. We need not to cross the red lines of those countries. So, for example, the efforts that we are doing for the stabilization, we realize that there's a red line in the political discussion between northeast and northwest Syria. Of course, the regime areas is beyond question, of course. So this red line regarding the political issues, where did we perceive it? In fact, Turkey's top concern is to establish a Kurdish state along its border. And so working politically between northeast and northwest Syria might lead to an implicit recognition or legitimization of northeast Syria. Therefore, the civil society organizations operating in North Syria or in both regions, the trans-border organizations are trying as much as possible to distance themselves from these red lines. However, at the end of the day, you are securing violations which might lead one day or might get us to understandings which will help the civil society. And so peace building needs custody. What we're doing is working from the bottom of the pyramid, working on the community issues with the local communities so that the communication will be revived between the different communities. I'm not sure how much everyone knows that the leverage areas in Syria are like separate. They are not connected. You have semi-borders, semi-boundaries, and very complicated cross-border processes. There's smuggling, even among civilians. Smuggling from one. So there's like geographic disconnection and therefore community disconnection. Because maybe one family between northeast and northwest, there might be accountability by the de facto forces if those family members would speak together in fear of spying or information communication, or this is CASA SDF and this is opposition. And so we're speaking about geographic ripping off, and we're speaking about community distancing. So what we're trying to do is to bridge this community gaps, which is going to get us someday to more proximity or to have custodial environment for broader peace building. I'm sorry, I've taken a long time.
No worries, Mansour. Thank you so much. Mutahara, turning to you. So I know that you've done a lot of work focusing on human rights abuses in Yemen, including those focused on abuses of children's rights. So I was wondering, how do you see integration of human rights and children's rights into peace negotiations? And how do you see this inclusion contributing to positive peace in Yemen?
Thank you so much, Vokashin. And I'd love to thank the DT Institute for providing me this opportunity to speak. So in the beginning, in the past decade of the war and conflict of Yemen, Yemeni people witnessed since the control of the Houthi groups, September 2014 to date. So the country have experienced a fierce armed conflict which threatened people's life, especially women and children and elderlies. And people with disabilities. During this period of time, their civil and political rights and socioeconomic and cultural rights have been totally violated. Many crimes and grave violations have been committed, which is an explicit violation of the humanitarian international law and the human rights law, which amplified the suffering of civilians with the expansion of the scope of the conflict. We have documented in the past period of time grave violations of civilians and targeting civilians and extra legal detention, planting mines, cutting roads, and violations of imposing restrictions. And also there was violations committed against the children from the different conflict parties, grave violations, and the children have been subject to being killed and sexual assault and injured and abduction and stealing their aids and relief and attacking hospitals and schools and also recruitment and engaging children in the fight, and especially by the Houthi groups, and especially after the October war and Gaza war. I mean, the Yemeni children in the past decade have been subject to a war against them, relentless war against them, and it's worthwhile to indicate that the absence of accountability locally and internationally amplified the suffering of civilians, and the parties have been committing more and more crimes, and violence is becoming the prevalent practice in the country. Another point is the war, the status of war. It's no peace. It led to the attrition of the official institution and the marginalization of those institutions which guarantee the human rights, supposedly. And it distracted the political memory and attacked the equal citizenship, and it enhanced the sectarian divisions and attacked the human rights. The important thing here is that the civil society organization and the international parties have to pressure the conflicting parties in Yemen. They have to integrate the children's justice and to engage the victims and their families, the woman violation, to release the forcibly disappeared and the forcibly detention, and the transitional justice to be engaged in the future peace and current peace negotiation and the remedy and compensation of the victims. And because we can't speak about a real and true and universal and justice and sustainable peace without a real engagement of the mostly affected groups, which are the civilians. And thank you.
So as we move to the second round of questions, I just wanted to remind one more time all our speakers just to speak a little bit slower so that our colleague Reem, who is simultaneously translating for us, can catch everything that they say. So the second round of questions will focus more on dynamics and influences shaping peace processes in Yemen, Syria, and Sudan, and the role that civil society plays in engaging with these regional powers that we just mentioned during the first set of questions. So, Maha, again, considering your extensive experience in supporting Sudan political transitions, both with the DT Institute and your previous experience, I was wondering if you can tell me a little bit more about specific strategies that Sudanese civil society have used to engage with these regional powers such as Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Egypt. How these strategies have been tailored to address the unique Sudan's conflict environment?
Yeah, thank you. So I think I would love just to touch very quickly on two international miscalculations that continue to negatively impact the role of civil society to engage with regional powers. First, the international community made a huge miscalculation when they left the internal political transition arrangement after the December 2018 revolution in the hands of those powers. That resulted in a weak civilian-led transitional government that fell a few months later. And then when the conflict erupted, the termination of the mandate of the United Nations Integrated Transitional Assistance Mission in Sudan was another miscalculated action by the UN and international community. because these have left the country and the civil society isolated and dominated by such spoiling powers. So what we do and what we need support from people like our audience and partners is, first of all, we continue working in leveraging regional diplomacy for advocacy. The Sudanese civil society have been strategically engaged in regional diplomacy channels to build support for peace building and anti-corruption initiatives. So by framing those issues within the broader context of regional stability, civil society have really appealed to regional powers' interests often stabilized Sudan. Second, engaging the regional and international human rights bodies. We need to continue talking, I think, talking with AU to understand, the African Union to understand their roles in supporting civil society to engage with regional powers. We need to extend discussions on the role of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, the fact-finding mission, the UN personal envoy. You know, those powers continues to bear responsibility to support the civil society to have a better role to play when it comes to engaging with civil society, when it comes to the civil society engagement with regional powers. Like, for instance, we know that the international ceasefire talks continues to fail in kind of reaching a serious gun silence in either through Jeddah or Geneva routes, but we still should continue to work to amplify the local civil society voices, either through the fact-finding mission, which is that used to be an effective strategy. We really need to support the civil society to document human rights violations that happening in Sudan now. We understand that people may have doubts about the effectiveness of such mechanisms, but still, I think in a country that really witnessing severe famine, atrocities, repression of operating rights, operating human rights, and continuation of conflicts, we really need to continue putting the international community before their responsibilities. Then another strategy that seems to be very effective in terms of sustainability is building coalitions and alliances with national and regional civil society, which is something that we continue to do at DT Institute in Sudan and Yemen. Then I think another strategy is really to keep utilizing the media and independent journalism to influence the public opinion. You know that civil society has been increasingly relying on independent media and journalists to document for corruption, as I mentioned, and human rights violations. So those documentations helps to appeal both regional and international audiences. So by raising the awareness through the regional media outlets and investigation, they could have drawn attention to the complicity of regional powers in war, economy, and manipulation of humanitarian aid and other corruption manifestations. I think my last point here is going to be to capitalize on the transitional moments. We know that during the political transition in 2019, the civil society have used that momentum to advocate for international and regional support for governance reform. So that's a strategy need to continue so that we can leverage these moments to secure commitment from regional powers for peace building and democratic transitions. I believe this advocacy will lead to a greater kind of regional cooperation in the early stages of Sudan transitional period once a peace agreement is reached.
Maha, thank you. So, Monzer, going back to you and Syrian civil society, he has been quite engaged in peace processes so far. So I was wondering, you know, from your perspective, do you believe that actually engaging with these regional actors is feasible and it's an effective strategy to advance local peace building efforts? And, you know, having had a few conversations with you about this, do you actually believe that these engagements with influential regional countries actually make sense?
Thank you again. To start with, well, okay, I'm going to speak about something special here. In most of our meetings regarding the Syrian crisis, we keep focusing with the countries that we meet with to speak about the Syrian cause, is that there's a need to respect the concerns of the regional countries of Syria, the concerns of Jordan, Saudi, among others, of the Captagon and arms smuggling, and they need to secure their borders. That's a fundamental demand. It's important for us as Syrians to meet this demand for the neighboring countries. The concerns of Turkey in Syria, i.e., establishing like a terrorist zone or the diffusion of an anti-Turkey party or the division of Syria, which is going to contribute to divide Turkey. These are concerns that needs to be respected. These are red lines of the regional countries, and working with them to reassure them that's something that should be actually a Syrian demand and a demand of the Syrian state in itself, and needs to be addressed. Because if we try to disrespect such concerns or to play them down or not to respect the red lines or demands, if we do so, then automatically we're expanding the scope of disrupting the political solution, and we are having more and more enemies, which in the first place, as you know, the Syrian regime is being disruptive to any progress or any political resolution in Syria. And so to seek assistance of the Syrian civil society organization as well as the Syrian opposition and revolutionary forces, the thing that they can seek assistance of is only the regional forces or the regional powers and international powers in Syria. They would secure pressuring in order to continue a political resolution. And as you know, whether in Geneva or the UN resolution or the different international resolutions in Syria, they all came up because of international pressure rather than as a result of more than 700,000 Syrian killed and injured, and thousands of those injured, and tens of thousands of detained or displaced, including the chemical attacks. Everything did not offer any progress to the Syrians in terms of the political process. The progress in the political resolution came only as a result of international power consensuses. So where does the problem lie, especially in the regional powers? The problem is in certain powers who wants to have a popular leverage, unacceptable leverage in Syria, like, for example, Iran. So Iran doesn't interfere for interests that they seek in Syria, but rather Iran wants to prevail and to control decision making in Syria. Iran is after expanding the ideology of Iran and their sect. They want the conversion of the Syrian people into Shiite in terms of the ideology. As we know, I think everyone knows the efforts of the Iranians along the Syria-Iraq borders, all the way to Damascus and then to Lebanon. It's efforts not only to protect their interests, but as well as to Fiat convert this society to be in the service of the Iranian interests. So here comes the problems between the interests and concerns that we need to consider and respect for certain countries, especially the regional countries, versus interests that cannot be addressed, for example, like what Iran is after in Syria. And then if we just skip the region and we go to the wider scope, like the international coalition, they want to counter ISIS, and also they want to counter the unacceptable leverage of Iran in Syria and the regional countries. Furthermore, I do believe that there's a positive role of the civil society in Syria, or any civil society actually, in peace building with the regional countries. So there's an indirect role in mediation. So, for example, the civil society organizations in Syria, or let's say when the earthquake took place in North Syria and South Turkey. We have seen a major mobilization of the local community in Syria, Northeast Syria, in support of Northwest Syria. So, who did this mediation in order to get the humanitarian relief, and also the participants in those campaigns in support of the Northwest? It was the civil society organizations. They communicated with the political parties and the different parties in both regions, and they facilitated this communication. So there's a mediation role, even at the regional level, not only the local actors. There's also there might be a mediation effort with Turkey, USA. So to deliver messages through the Syrian civil society organizations. Additionally, and I'm going to conclude saying that we must make the distinction between those countries and their interests and what they are after from us as people and country, to be able to interact with their interests and concerns. And thank you.
Ansar, thank you very much for your answer. And Mutahar, now turning to you, I have a slightly different question for you, and that is civil society, local civil society organizations cannot do all this on their own. And I know that in the past you have collaborated a lot with numerous international organizations to advocate for human rights in Yemen. So I was wondering, if you can share some examples of successful partnership with international organizations, including international human rights organizations, that have led to a tangible impact on the ground and have advanced peace process.
Thank you again. I can say that the Rust and the civil society organizations in Yemen in the past years have played different roles, including the documentation of the human rights violations in Yemen. So that's my first point, and we're still doing this job. We are documenting and detecting the human rights violation and communicating that to the international actors, be it UN agencies or the supporting organizations or international organizations working on protecting the human rights. But I need to clearly indicate that the international actors, and we lost him.
Yeah, let's give Mutahar a moment to potentially reconnect. Is everyone else online? Yeah, it seems that we are. It's just Mutahar. Okay, maybe Patricia, while we are waiting for Mutahar to join us, I can turn to you, and we can when he's back and when you finish, your answer, I can get back to him. So I was wondering, from now different perspective, and that is more from the perspective of an international organization. What organizations such as Freedom House can do to support local civil society organizations in these conflict areas to engage with these regional powers when it comes to peace processes more effectively?
Question, and I'll respond to your comments, but I want to say a few things, drawing a little bit on what some of the activists on this panel have talked about. And the reality, before we talk about engagement, the reality really is that regional powers, at least from my perspective, or I would argue, whether it's Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, the UAE, and others, I would argue that all of them have played to a certain extent, they've sought to compete or to undermine peace processes that are not to their advantage or in their interest in many of their spheres of influence. And arguably, we can say some are more nefarious than others. And I'm looking at Monzer, because he did make some sort of a distinction in his response. Because we've already mentioned Iran, let's take, for example, Turkey and the UAE, who are engaged in this decade-long feud that is really trying to reshuffle the geopolitical order in the Middle East and North Africa. And they're waging as existential rivals. They're waging a series of proxy wars between the Horn of Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean. And again, this rivalry plays out also in Washington and in Europe, as well as in the media discourse and the energy industry, etc. And both have deployed these competing narratives on the ideological nature of the conflicts they're involved in, and have benefited politically from the confrontation, and have used it to bolster their positions, whether domestically or internationally. And others like Iran and which one did I not mention? Saudi have done similarly in different places. So my point is that all in all, these powers have done nothing but promote undemocratic outcomes. And in doing so, I would argue, have no interest in peace. So to assume that they have an interest or even a shared interest in stability is, in my view, false. And I think their distinct competing interests are in alignment in all the places where they're involved, ironically. In other words, from their point of view, it's a better outcome to have conflict continue. So they don't have a constructive role. I think Maha pointed this out quite eloquently. They don't really have constructive roles in shaping conflict resolution. Where they're involved, like in Sudan, for example, where neither regional actor, neither Egypt nor the UAE, believes it can win, they prefer the situation to let the conflict continue rather than concede defeat and have the other party win. So if you isolate their influence, it doesn't really work, and de-escalating in some ways is the only approach. How can these civil society organizations engage with these powers? What can international organizations like Freedom House and others do? I think that while the acquiescence of armed groups is needed to stop the ones involved in conflict is without a doubt needed to stop the fighting. Linking back to my previous sort of intervention, beyond those who are waging and fanning the flames of conflict, I think the focus should be on their enablers. And here, civil society groups and their communities, with support from international organizations, and I hope I'm reaffirming a little bit some of what the activists themselves have mentioned and talked about, they can demand, and I would argue maybe that's the only thing they could do, that the competing powers stop and engage with each other to reach a compromise, whether by engaging with international institutions, as Maha suggested, or through coalition building or media influence to engage public opinion through a variety of means, to reach a compromise that enables peace to happen, with the objective of that the funders, that the sponsors of local parties that are fighting each other reach a deal that balances their interests, and there is a stop to the funding of the killing, you know. So, for example, I'll just use the case of Yemen, but this applies everywhere. The only non-destructive outcome that one can hope for is for the fighting to stop. And when funding of the fighting stops, the fighting stops. When funders believe that not funding is detrimental to their interest, that will happen. So in the meantime, support needs to be channeled to continue to enable impactful efforts on the ground to continue. To the extent that there are local actors doing something good, they need to be supported at face value. And one thing to note, and I'll close, Vukashin, and this panel has made it clear, is that local organizations have become really significant or influential in advocating or in being advocates of peace and stability over the course of wars and conflict. And one thing that we didn't talk about, but maybe our activists on the panel have insights, but women's groups have in particular made important contributions to to providing some sort of social stability when the country's social fabric comes apart. And their insights into local dynamics and their practical experience brokering truces or doing work to free prisoners or in transitional justice processes has been invaluable to peace builders and to international organizations involved in promoting peace building. And these, one needs to continue to draw on women's knowledge and women's experiences in these to try to hammer out roadmaps towards sort of peace. And I'll stop.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I was wondering if Mutahar, if you're back, we would be. I would be more than happy to give you an opportunity to finish the answer to your question. So, yeah, if you are just continue where you stop.
Thank you. I'm sorry for the glitch. I'm going to resume speaking about the international actors, civil society organization interaction. So in Rust Coalition, the Yemeni coalition, and Justice for Yemen Pact, which includes 10 organizations, we have good communication with a number of actors. And if we're going to classify the international coalitions, it's first of all, actors, it's first of all the UN. He's breaking. So, and we update them of the human rights situation in Yemen. And the other thing, and the most important agency, the sanctions agency on Yemen, subsidy to the Security Council, which annually reports, and they have presence on the field, and they get their information from different sources, including the civil society. And such reports are do classify the human rights, and they signal the perpetrators explicitly. And the other agency of the UN is
Mutahar, I apologize. Yes. I need to interrupt you just for a second. Can you speak just a little bit closer to the mic? We really don't hear you well, and our colleague that is doing translation is having issues. So yes, if you can just volume up a little bit, and let's try again. You don't need to repeat anything. Just continue.
واضح الآن ريم.
Okay. So another point, we do cherish our partnership with the DT Institute and something also. Over the past 2.5 years, we relentlessly implemented many processes within Rust and Justice for Yemen Pact. So during those couple of years, we issued dozens of reports, dozens of human rights statements, and we announced the adoption of advocacy campaigns in cooperation with the local civil society in Yemen and the regional organization, as well as the international, on human rights advocacy and protection and peace building. We do believe that this step is a positive step that enhances the protection of human rights in Yemen and seeks a real advocacy for the victims. Okay. And regarding, he's breaking. And the important role, okay, he's really breaking.
Okay. Let's move on to the third and final set of questions that I had for our colleagues today, and I would like to focus now a little bit on the opportunities and challenges in this bilateral advocacy. And Maha, I wanted firstly to turn it to you and to hear from you what are the key lessons learned from engaging in bilateral advocacy, and what are the things that we can take forward, and that can be applied to enhance local peace building capacities in this regard when it comes to, I would say both in general advocacy and then as well engagement with regional powers.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Bukashan. I think when we look at how those regional powers are dominating the situation in Sudan, and when we look at the reluctance of international community to take firm actions really to stabilize Sudan, I think we need just to play it smart so that we need to represent it in a different way. Like, for instance, providing economic framing of peace building initiatives so that by linking anti-corruption and peace building efforts to economic stability and growth, civil society organizations in Sudan might be able to attract the interest of regional powers who are keen to protect their economic investments and interest in Sudan. So how we can apply that could be, as I mentioned, through local peace building initiatives, so that they can frame their interventions in a way that help stabilizing the governance and reforming governance, so that to emphasize on how peace building effort can contribute to improve business conditions and regional development. And in this case, in particular, maybe we need to think of the role of the private sector, their roles in reconstruction and development when a peace agreement is reached. And this will take me to the other point on the institutional reform, particularly on how we can or we should dismantle the economic cartels affiliated to the military institutions, just from a corruption and resource monopoly perspective. That dimension really has to do with human rights and peace building initiatives. Then I think speaking about the context sensitive engagement, so we can avoid backlashes. I mean, sometimes maybe the direct challenging of political systems or empowered political systems in the region can backfire, so that civil society might really need to be vigilant to that. And they really need to learn from the regional government on how to engage with regional government in a way that, as I mentioned, that bring kind of mutual incentive. So this approach could encourage like a gradual reform without triggering adversaries of the regional stakeholders. So I think that's context-sensitive engagement, really important to inform the peace-building efforts. My third point is really related to what we call it from project management perspectives, a bottom up and top down relationship. I really think it's the right time for international community, really, and this is a takeaway for everyone on this call and even beyond. It's really the time for international community to rectify the miscalculations and relying on regional powers to stabilize Sudan. The international community may really need to revisit its reluctance, as I mentioned, in balancing their bilateral relations with those regional powers, and the need to take firm actions to end regional and international peace and security threats caused by the increasing influence of those powers. At that point, the civil society cannot do the job alone. They really need to have collective international political will. Civil society will need increased also access to funding, not only for humanitarian purposes, but also for documenting atrocities for future accountability. Also, I think another takeaway as we are approaching the UN General Assembly, we need to think of the dynamics in the UN Security Council, the A3 blocks, how they can inform the involvement of the African Union in Sudan, and how this may affect the space for civil society. And then also, I think it's really the time for the international community really to set regional monitoring and accountability mechanisms, just to monitor the financial assistance that goes to countries like Egypt to support the humanitarian or to support the Sudanese refugees in Egypt. There is a need to monitor that money, how those countries are spending this money. Also, we need to ensure that there is a full execution of integrity and transparency at the level of humanitarian agencies in Sudan. We are just now reading the news, the involvement of a senior WFP staff in Sudan in hiding information from donors on the obstruction of humanitarian assistance by the de facto government. We really need to look into those. Like while there are some actors willing to support, we need to ensure integrity and transparency among those institutions. I think my final word is going to be, it's a call on everyone who's really following what happens in Sudan. We really need to collectively work to set in place special migration accommodations in countries of refuge for Sudanese civil society organizations, for even Sudanese populations. This dimension is being missing along the road. I think really Sudan crisis can't wait. We need to help civil society organizations who are starting to reoperate in regional countries. They need to have a dignified immigration status so that they can support doing what they need to do. Yeah, and I will stop here.
Thank you. Thank you, Maha. And Patricia, now going back to you, I was wondering, a very similar question to one that I had for Maha. From your perspective, what approaches would you recommend to international NGOs to strengthen their engagement on these forgotten conflicts? And what are alternative strategies that they can pursue to advance and advocate better for the peaceful resolution of these conflicts?
You know, the reality is I mean, let's call it, I mean, for lack of a better word, like democracy promotion or peace building efforts, or for organizations that are engaged in this sort of work. The state of play, I mean, these are not the only forgotten conflicts, by the way, but the state of play is such that traditional sort of democracy promotion or peace building effort need to be adapted. The outlook for the region is really not positive. I mean, we have democratic indicators that are regressing. We have fractured political scenes. We have where illiberal actors are gaining leverage over liberal ones. You have governance that is, to say the least, imperfect, and most of these countries suffer under sort of corrupt, parasitic, or simply unresponsive political systems. You have overly centralized bureaucracies, bloated public sectors, you know, which have also translated into negative economic indicators. And you have the gradual disengagement of the US. And you have increased disaffection with the US after Gaza, and in tandem, the entrenchment of what we've been discussing today, the entrenchment of Russia, plus this regional competition for influence between Iran, Turkey, and other actors. And you have other sources of insecurities like climate and geopolitics-driven types of insecurities, food insecurity, etc. All that to say that the space for citizen engagement and representation has shrunk and continues to shrink. And I say that just as a backdrop for what I'm going to say, which is, of course, you know, the approach has to be that local groups and activists in conflict and authoritarian countries, I'm lumping that too, who are really committed to this kind of work. And we heard from the panel that how relevant the work of such organizations are, needs to be supported. And any sort of kernel, I would say, that remains in some of these very, very tough settings, a kernel of activism in this regard and efforts to continue from the ground up to build resilient, inclusive communities and push back against, you know, actors who are promoting violence, I think needs to be supported, or efforts need to be double up. Meanwhile, now NGOs, I think NGOs is also to focus on local initiatives and continue to do the work that leads to improving the lives of those within their reach, within their constituencies. Superpower dynamics, so to speak, I mean, maybe regional big power dynamics are difficult to change. So I think that atomistic, as opposed to more of a holistic approach, may be more effective, even though that's not necessarily a very hopeful thing. But down the line, I think really incremental improvements may really lead to positive outcomes.
Thank you, Patricia. Monzer, let me get to you now, and very similar question for you. So, what strategies going forward could you and your other colleagues working for Syrian civil society organizations pursue to achieve, more sustainable peace building goals, both engaging with, I would say, these regional powers that we were talking so much during this event, but then also in general when engaging with other international institutions and others who are involved in the Syrian conflict.
Thank you again. In fact, the most important thing I'd love to speak about here is flexibility. Flexibility among the civil society organizations is something paramount, is something essential for them to be able to interfere and to be assisting entities in the capacity building processes. By flexibility, I mean, well, you have goals, you have many goals. For each state, there are many goals. So to continue pursuing one of the goals, despite that it looks impossible, I think that's just a disruption of the peace process. So nowadays in Syria, for example, people want political change. It's not there. Regime change. It's not there. Let's find other ways which might lead to this destination, or other ways which might lead to many pieces here and there, like Patricia mentioned, the atomic versus the holistic. So those incremental peace here and there, they can be categorized into different things, might be humanitarian, implicit, maybe deal regarding a vaccination or certain contagious diseases, documents and IDs. So don't just be stubborn about something and then you just get stuck. You don't want, to go around it until you get to the goal. No, actually think of mini goals. Think of implementable, actionable. Therefore, for example, in the stabilization support unit, we believe that we saw that the political resolution is difficult, and the control areas with some sort of community freedom or some flexibility to hear the different opinions. It was northeast and northwest Syria more than the regime-held areas. And so this flexibility, to what extent can you stretch it? It's just to stay away from the political agreements between the parties. Okay, yeah, we can deal with that. So we drew a strategy of 4 points. First of all, the interventions and working on the humanitarian aspects. So at present, we're working on that to facilitate the humanitarian access by the DT support, DT Institute. Between Northeast and Northwest Syria, the citizens are suffering, those who want to cross from here to there. There's like a border crossing or so, with terrible services and extremely difficult procedures. So now we are mediating to facilitate crossing the border. And similarly, the other humanitarian aspects that we've mentioned. So the second thing, maybe also to work on the community issues. Different people of the same area are speaking together. But an example, for example, I come from Manbij in northeast Syria, but I can't go there. I live in Turkey and then northwest Syria, so I keep commuting. So there, many people are like me from northeast and but also northwest. So why not having people in terms? So we concluded a community principle document, as we called it. The third thing, it's to work on the technical aspects, like we've mentioned earlier, the vaccination, medical thing, economy, water supply, ID documents, many things that we can act on, but it needs mediation by the civil society organization. And the last point that we're working on for a breakthrough is also is to work on the civil society organization, or the crossing border civil society organizations between the two parties. For example, the educational organizations working in both areas, medical maybe, civil society organizations concerned with the public affairs or so on. So they meet together, they conclude certain policies or procedures. So all those factors together, these are carriers of peace. They end up with a community peace, and they can lead to political breakthroughs. And they mitigate the tension between the two regions. However, yeah, you just don't go to the goals directly, you just go around them this way. And so the civil society organization's role is paramount, is effective in the peace building, and we should work and consider on the micro pieces or the incremental piece, the partner. And just to conclude, I'm not sure if I've taken longer than I should. So in conclusion, regarding the regional thing, the civil society organization should play an active role in the indirect mediation, even with the regional parties, to bridge the gap and to mitigate the tension, especially regarding the concerns of those powers interfering in the conflict. And also, the interests of the regional countries should be respected in the work that we're doing for the peace building. And as we've mentioned, the rational, the acceptable interests, of course, not the Iranian interests I just mentioned. Moreover, we need to take into account the concerns that make sense of the neighboring countries, especially as I've mentioned, that the borders is a matter of national security for the neighboring countries. Also, the political advocacy that the civil society organization is doing, that's important because sometimes the official political institutions, they have high accessibility, they have pressuring manners, and so the pressuring entity which can work more freely is the civil society, because they can keep demanding the rights of the society. That's it from my side, and thank you.
Ansar, thank you so much. And Mutakar, just you have the privilege to have the last question and last answer before we wrap up this discussion. So, I wanted to ask you, in the case of Yemen, how civil society can be more effectively integrated into the peace negotiations, and how they can influence better both peace negotiations that are ongoing now and any future ones.
Hello again. So for this random war in Yemen, it's time to come to an end, and the burden was always on the street men, the civilians. This war has imposed its clear divisions between the Yemeni. In Yemen, we have two currencies and two banks. With the war, the private sector have flourished, no more public education, more illiteracy, and so the children are being recruited as encouraged by the family to get a wage or just to get food. So the needs of the Yemenis is more pressing than ever to come to an end to the war and to establish a comprehensive and just peace that ensures the equal citizenship and justice, and the remedy and compensation to victims. The civil society in Yemen is pro-peace and ending the war. We stress our welcoming to any peace efforts in Yemen, and we support the need of the pressing need to peace, especially after this long years of bloody war. People are speaking about negotiations between Saudi and Houthis with an Omani broking, but this will open a room for many speculations and concerns of the consequences of a resolution that will not produce to real peaceful. So this is happening undercover. The only interpretation is that there's some circumvention around the rules of peace, as well as on the number of rules of the negotiation between the Yemeni parties. So that's my first point. And the second one is the pressing need for the recognition of the rights of the victims of the conflict in Yemen, and the importance of establishing justice for the future political and economic future of Yemen. There's absence of representation or even respect of the voices of victims in the official negotiations. It has been totally absent in light of the political and military competing agendas of the actors in Yemen and in the neighboring countries and international community. And my third point is that in the conclusion, I would share a number of recommendations for the rival forces in Yemen to consider the peace in Yemen. I mean, the sponsors of the Peacebuilders in Yemen. We advise the conflicting parties to stop the war and to recognize the rights of the victims and their families and survivors, of engaging them in all the current and future peace negotiations, and an active enforcement of transitional justice. The government needs to facilitate the work of these organizations. My second point, to include the rights of victims and children's justice as a paramount priority in the peace negotiations, to administer the justice and accountability. Third, enhancing and supporting the adoption of a comprehensive national approach for the transitional justice by benefiting from the national dialogue conference experiences, merging the relevant justice principle in the customary law and the local legislations. And finally, I would recommend the international community to intensify the women defenders of human rights in Yemen, especially in the Houthi-controlled area. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mutahara. And I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. I hope that this is just first in a series of discussions that we are going to have on this subject, and that we are going to continue working as a community on trying to figure out how both local civil society organizations and or international organizations can continue to advocate more effectively for a peaceful resolution of conflicts in MENA region and other regions, and in line with that, how they can engage with increasingly influential countries in these regions that do have a say over conflicts and how they will end. So thank you one more time all for participating in this discussion. I would like to thank our speakers and the organizers of the PeaceCon for an opportunity to talk about this matter, and I hope to be in touch with all of you soon, again talking about this and other issues of importance for human rights, governance and democracy worldwide. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.